This tree was actually growing on a neighbor's property. Of course, when I got it, it was only about 3.5, 4 foot tall. But I don't know if you can tell at the bottom, sorry about the movement, it makes like this Nike swoosh. Well, when I first got the tree, it was actually growing out from underneath another tree. And its Nike swoosh was growing out like at a 30-degree angle. From here, it was growing out this way. And over a period of time, of course, it was only like 3.5 foot tall when I got it. And over a period of time, it kind of pulled itself more upright, but the base stayed with the Nike swoosh. And so this tree is probably another, I don't know how this one is. But it has done very well, and it straightened itself up, but you know, it's got the telltale Nike swoosh. And these two trees, the bigger of the two, there used to be a Westfield style, the place where I hang up clothes. A little T-post growing up there, and they were hanging their laundry on it, and next to that little post was this tree. After a while I got tired of mowing around that post, and so I dug that post up very carefully, and this tree came up. It was there. The tree beside it, this next one smaller, is its offspring. And then there's a third one there as well. You can barely see it, but there's a third one in there, and he's an offspring as well. So again, this is another tree that I just made it possible for it to grow and nurtured it, and it became what it is. So now I've got lots of shade. I've got an interesting story behind my tree. Aha. This tree is one that I grew from seed and then planted here. So the purpose that when it gets tall enough that it'll help shade my house, it needs to be about 10 feet taller. But this is another tree I grew from seed. I nurtured, and then Mother Nature took care of the rest. The pecan. And the story behind this tree is that it was growing in a lady that I worked with. She bought some property. She has a pecan on her property, but the former owners was a rental. So we got out one day and raked up the backyard and put the pile into a mulch, and then this pecan showed up. She didn't care for it, so I dug it up, transplanted it, nurtured it for a year or two, and then planted it here. This tree is all of 17 years old, I think. I could be wrong. It may be only 13. I forget. The story behind this tree. This tree was actually an elm that I had grown in a pot. It had grown for 3 or 4 years in the pot. When I went to go move it, I realized that the taproot had snuck out of the pot, was in the ground. And well, if you cut the taproot on a tree, it usually, it was so big that, if you cut the taproot, it probably wasn't going to survive or it truncated its growth. So what I did is I cut the bucket away, piled up a bunch of dirt around the base, and let it grow. There's actually 2 trees there, and they both did the same thing. One's become more dominant. The smaller second one I think I've got to take out. I don't think it's going to grow well. Anyway, this is one of those stupid is as stupid does, and usually I try to move my pots around or replant the trees to biggers. And the reason I do that is the lesson learned from this tree. However, it's growing in a good place. I'm happy to have it, and that's the story behind this tree. The pecan. Now the story behind this tree is I had gone around gathering bags of leaves from people and had gotten a compost pile. And in that compost pile, this tree sprouted, but it didn't sprout here. So I dug it up, transplanted it to a pot, nurtured it for a couple of years, then put it here. And this is one that Mother Nature volunteered, and I just founded a home, a forever home, and that's where it is. So my pecans are just now beginning to produce pecans. They're not really big, but hey, a tree is a tree. Here, there's actually 4 trees here. There's I believe it was a red oak, an elm, and a pecan. The red oak I put first. It grew. That's the one that grows mostly in the center there, right through here. And The elm showed up, and I let it grow. And later on, the squirrels planted the pecan, guess from where. And it now has a second sister. But anyways, you can barely tell. Those two tree trunks are growing pretty close to each other, and they will grow up together and probably become one tree. There's the two pecans, a big one, and the tiny offspring. And there's a squirrel. A snail, not a squirrel, a snail. I hate those snails. So anyways, this is my little family of trees I've got. This is a small plot I had, and I put the elm in first. Elms came up, and later on some oak trees came up. Problem is the elms had dominated the landscape, and so the oak trees had no choice but to kind of grow out flat and kind of sneak out from underneath. There were actually 3 elms in there, and last count there were 3 oaks. However, the oaks are not, they're not growing straight up. They started growing straight up, and then they took a 90-degree, and they're coming off to the side now. These are trees that actually did the first one. The 2 of those I planted. The 3rd one came up by itself. And the oaks just showed up. Because there's a big-ass oak tree here that's on property. And it volunteers lots of trees. Lots of trees. It just went to seed, and soon I should have a plethora of oak seeds. And I will put some, scatter some around the back of the property and see where they come up. Story about this tree here. This tree was growing on the property, and originally it was just the tiny little sapling that had donated itself. However, right there where it stands, there was a rose bush that the previous owner had planted, and I didn't care for roses one way or the other, but it was growing, and I'm like, okay, so I'll let it. Then one day I was mowing, and I looked down and I noticed that next to the rose bush, it wasn't much of a rose bush, tell you the truth, was a little elm tree coming up. Now granted, at the time it's probably about 14 inches tall. So I reached down and pulled up that rose bush, and now we got a tree. That's probably around 14 years of growth.